Hi, I'm Julie Zuckerman, and welcome to the October Literary Modiin Author Event. My little introduction here is a re-recording since we had a technical glitch at the beginning of the recording of the live event. Last year, shortly after my book, The Book of Jeremiah, a novel and stories, came out, we began the Literary Modiin Author Series as a way to bring local Israel-based authors to the large English-speaking community in Modiin. For those who don't know, Modiin is a planned city in between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, not far from the airport, and I hope you'll come visit me the next time you're here. We held several events in the Sklar Levy Gallery, an art gallery here in Modiin, and I also recommend a visit there. Once the pandemic hit, we switched to an online format, which allows us to bring together authors and readers from all over Israel, the US, and really from anywhere. This is our fourth virtual event. And you can see here a partial stack of books by the authors we've hosted. Before I introduce Aaron Hamburger, our first speaker, I'd just like to make one PSA, public service announcement. Not only do I hope you'll consider buying the books you're about to hear about, but one of the most important things you can do to help an author whose book you've enjoyed is to write a review, whether that's on Amazon or Goodreads or both. It's the best way to help spread the word about a great book. So please write reviews, even if they're only 1 or 2 sentences. Aaron Hamburger is our first speaker. He's the author of the story collection The View from Stalin's Head, which is a winner of the Rome Prize in Literature, and the novels Faith for Beginners and Nirvana is Here. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Tin House, Poets and Writers, Boulevard, and the Oprah magazine. Now here's Aaron, and this is when the live event begins, and my apologies, the first minute or so of his talk wasn't caught on the recording. Thanks and enjoy.
Those artificial, arbitrarily chosen starting and endpoints creates the kind of shape that your narrative has. So that's why like courtroom stories are so popular, because they have this natural beginning, middle, and end, this natural shape that people can identify easily and follow along. And that's important because oddly, like one of the most important questions your reader wants to know when they start a book is, when is this going to be over and how will I know? So this is one of the most important choices that we make as fiction writers. Where do we start? Where do we end? And how does that give your story a shape? So I mention this because when I started writing Nirvana is Here, it began as a series of short pieces that I was writing. And my goal was to channel as much emotion as I could into my writing. But at some point, I had to make this fundamental choice. What kind of shape was it going to give my story? When would it be set? When would it start? When would it end? Just for background, the main character of Nirvana is Here is a medieval historian named Ari Silverman, who is about to reunite with a high school classmate named Justin, whom he hasn't seen in 20 years. And the prospect of this meeting sets off bittersweet memories of his high school years when Ari, who is a white Jewish kid from the suburbs of Detroit, transfers schools after being raped by a classmate. At his new school, he begins an unlikely friendship with Justin, who's a Black scholarship student from the city of Detroit. As I looked for shape for my story, I originally thought of using the 4 years of high school as my structure, which is something I had seen other writers do, like, for example, Curtis Sittenfeld in her novel Prep, or even J.K. Rowling with her Harry Potter series, where it's like 7 books and each book corresponds to a year in Harry Potter's education. But there was something that seemed a little bit flabby about that structure. It made the pacing feel kind of slow. And one of the things about fiction is that the more that you compress time, the more you generate tension and suspense. So I needed something a little tighter. So I started researching the time period that I had in mind for my story, which was the late 80s and early 90s. And I found something interesting, which was the band Nirvana, whom my characters might have been listening to, released their breakthrough hit single, Smells Like Teen Spirit, in September of 1991. And pretty soon their album unexpectedly knocked Michael Jackson off the top of the Billboard music charts, very famously. And then 3 years later, in April of 1994, Kurt Cobain killed himself, ending the sort of meteoric rise and fall of the band. So I thought about this, and I was like, there was my shape, 3 years. And as readers are kind of following the rise and fall of Nirvana, which maybe they've even, they're a little familiar with, they're also following the rising and falling action of the story. So the shape added like this kind of pleasing asymmetry to my original 4 years of high school structure. Also, by changing the 4 years of high school to 3, And I had my protagonist, Ari, start a new school as a sophomore rather than as a freshman. It accentuates that something has gone wrong because now he stands out. It invites questions that he would want to avoid. Why didn't you start at the same time as everyone else? And for Ari, the answer to that question is a dangerous secret that he's trying to keep close to the vest. So I'm now going to read to you a short sample from the book, which takes place about 3/4 of the way through when Ari is going to attend a Nirvana concert with his friend Justin. And what I like about this is that just as Nirvana is reaching sort of the apex of their fame, so too is the book bringing Ari and Justin closer and closer to the kind of climax of their friendship, which is going to take a dramatic turn right after this scene. And by the way, I've actually never been to a Nirvana concert. So if people are interested, maybe during the Q&A, I'd be happy to talk about how I researched the concert they attended, which actually occurred at the Michigan State Fairgrounds in Detroit in the fall of 1993. So here we go. Justin told me to meet him in the school parking lot that Friday night. Why? I asked suspiciously. Don't ask so many questions, he said. So I showed up at the appointed time wearing one of my painting shirts, splattered with streaks of vermilion and cerulean blue. Justin pulled up in his beat-up Honda. He had on beaten jeans with a thick, faded hoodie, worn and very soft. Maybe he'd let me borrow them sometime to fold up and tuck under my ear at night like a pillow. We could trade clothes, so what would he want of mine? Ready, he said as I got in beside him. I shrugged. I guess, I said. I don't know what I should be ready for. Justin shoved my arm. What's up with you tonight? Why are you so gloomy? I'm just hungry, I lied. So we stopped for candy at a grocery down the road from school. I love suburban supermarkets, Justin said, his fingers trailing over boxed sheet cakes, their smooth white plains of frosting dotted with pink and yellow roses. Where I live, all the rolls and cakes are so old you could use them for penicillin, he said. The sausages are dried up like raisins. You can sink your thumb right through the tomatoes. You're exaggerating. I took advantage of the joke to poke his side. Not by much. He poked me back, just above my hip. I took out my wallet to buy the candy, but Justin said, You're always buying me stuff, like I can't take care of myself. Fine, I said, depressed, as I put my wallet away. A pack of Twizzlers for my boy here, Justin told the daydreaming girl with braces at the register, busy mouthing the words to a chirpy love song playing overhead. Back at the car, Justin said, Think you dropped something. Huh? Check your seat, brain. Sitting on the passenger seat were two waxy white rectangles of paper with a Ticketmaster logo on the top, 2 concert tickets. All ages welcome, I read aloud, and then paused. 2 concert tickets, all ages welcome to Nirvana. Nirvana? How did you get these? I asked, pinching the tickets to make sure they were real. Yes, that's what was printed on those tickets, cradled in my trembling palm. I'd never attended a real concert before. When these tickets had gone on sale late last summer, they'd all been bought up before I could even figure out where to buy them. You don't want to go? To have Justin and Kurt Cobain in the same room, it seemed like too much. Yes, I said finally, emphatically. Yes, of course I want to go. Justin, this is the nicest thing anyone's ever done for me. Good, he said with a gracious, relaxed smile, for once with no trace of irony. You deserve to have people do nice things for you. The concert was only 20 minutes away at the State Fairgrounds Coliseum, just inside the city limits. The crowd streaming out of their cars was mostly white kids in beat-up jeans with shredded hems, plaid shirts, and worn t-shirts thin as vellum paper, scrawled with the names of punk bands that even Justin didn't know. He refused the money I offered him for a ticket. Remember, he said, I promised to give you something from Detroit. Anyway, it was only 25 bucks. You probably spent more than that on that candy from Israel you gave me all those years. You knew I bought it for you, I said. I kind of figured it out, he said sheepishly. You're not a very good liar. No, I laughed. I guess not. One of the warm-up bands was already playing when we walked into the hall. Apparently that's what you wanted to do, miss the warm-up acts. Our tickets were general admission. And Justin grabbed me by the elbow, trying to get us as close to the stage as we could, though not all the way where the mosh pit was. I admired how experienced he was at this. The air in the room had a dense, grassy, sweaty smell and felt heavy and warm on my cheeks. I tried to check out the people standing near me in case there was someone in the crowd who might be the bullying type, ready for a fight. But it was impossible to get a fix on anyone. They all kept moving around. As I stretched out my right arm to roll up my sleeve, I accidentally hit some guy in the back. I apologized twice, but he didn't seem to care. The band on stage screamed their lungs out and beat the crap out of their drums while we in the audience milled around in small circles of conversation and ignored them. I felt sorry for them up there, but I didn't care for their music. When they finished, Justin and I stood our ground as people filled in the empty spaces they could find. We were not talking, and maybe not minding that we weren't talking. Anyway, I couldn't think of words. I was too busy taking it in. Dyed, stringy hair, damp with grease, pierced ears and noses and eyebrows and lips, thick, rough bodies pushing past us toward the black wall of speakers on stage, the anxious pre-concert chatter of the crowd around us, everyone only half listening while keeping an eye up front for the slightest sign of movement, and thin clouds of smoke rising in wisps up toward the rafters where a pair of unlucky pigeons were flying in sloppy, frenzied circles, searching for an exit. Two guys next to me were debating whether In Utero or Nevermind or Bleach was Nirvana's masterpiece when the lights all went out and everyone screamed at once. I heard a harsh buzzing noise followed by the squeal of a guitar, and then the lights came back on, spotlighting Dave Grohl behind the drums. The crowd pressed Justin and me forward, and a heavy boot kicked the back of my leg as Chris Novoselic bounced onto the stage, bopping up and down, tall, lanky, and awkward. Someone up there, maybe Chris, yelled, "Detroit!" And finally Kurt himself appeared. He was maybe 50 feet away, or was it a mile? He planted himself at the microphone and hunched forward into it almost reluctantly. Behind him loomed a large mannequin with its guts exposed. Here they were. Nirvana, I thought. Nirvana is here. He seemed smaller than on screens or magazine covers. His hair was red, orange, brown, and blonde all at once. His baggy clothes dripped off his narrow shoulders. A guitar dangled from around his neck as he leaned forward to howl out the lyrics to Drain You. His voice sounded thinner, more piercing than on the album, fragile to the point of breaking, especially on the high notes, and then occasionally, surprisingly, melodic. A fat guy with long blonde Jesus hair and a beard was thrashing around in a circle, trying to get his own private mosh pit going. I was afraid to lose Justin, who was jumping up and down and screaming. I didn't know why. He said he didn't like Nirvana. He was only here for my sake. A girl was hoisted up over our shoulders and her boot hit the back of my neck. Another guy rammed into me and Justin pushed him back. The guy, instead of getting mad, howled, "Yeah!" And Justin howled, "Yeah!" And then at me, "Come on, brain." So I jumped too, carefully at first, then higher, harder, until soon I was slamming my body around in a circle, flinging my fists in the air over and over. And then they played the song, Rape Me. Just before the release of In Utero, the single Rape Me caused a brief ripple of controversy when Walmart refused to carry the entire album until the song was relabeled as Waif Me on the packaging. The mainstream media all demanded to know, was Kurt for or against rape? "Go ahead and rape me," Kurt was singing. "Do your worst. Be a big man. You think you made me your victim, but I won't let you because I'm giving you permission to do it. I can take anything you've got and survive." Yes, yes, and yes, I wanted to scream. Maybe I was screaming. Someone took off his shoe and threw it at Kurt's head. Kurt grabbed the shoe, looked at it for a second, then threw it back at the crowd and stomped off the stage. A few minutes later, circus music played on the sound system and the lights came up. The concert was over, but I could still hear the music, could still sense it in the buzzing in my ears, the smell of smoke on my clothes. I was happy. And Justin, covered in sweat, glowed beside me like some kind of angel. I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's great. And if you guys are familiar with Zoom, you can add your reactions on the bottom of There's like a little reaction. There you go. Your brother's familiar with Zoom. Thank you, Erin. That was great. We're going to save questions for Erin till the end. And now we're going to move to Riva Lehrer. Riva Lehrer is an artist, writer, and a curator who focuses on socially challenged bodies. She is best known for representations of people whose physical embodiment, sexuality, or gender identity have long been stigmatized. Her memoir, Golem Girl, was published 2 weeks ago, and she's getting a ton of press. And I'm like feeling just watching on Facebook all the things that. So I will turn it over to Riva now, and love to hear from you.
This is what the book looks like. We care more about that than what I look like, so I could just read like this, but perhaps that would not be useful. The only things that I guess you need to know are that the book is about two primary themes. Growing up with a disability called spina bifida, and later becoming a portrait artist who, as Julie says, is interested in people who deal with stigma because of either the way they look or the way that they present in the world. Before I read, I just thought I would try and show you a few of what so the book is full of art. And here's the wonderful thing, is that if you get this book, you not only get a story, you get almost complete catalog raisonné of my work. So I don't know if you can see this. Here's a self-portrait. They did an amazing thing with this book, by the way. They did full color on page, which is not cheap, but they kept it at normal hardbook price because they really wanted the book to get out there. So there's another. And
Riva, people are saying they're having a hard time hearing you. Can you speak a little closer to the mic?
oh, good. Not so much, really, but we'll try.
That's better. That's better.
Okay, I'm basically in nose hair range here, but okay. I don't need to go back, do I? I don't need to go back. Okay, so let's just start reading. The other thing you need to know for this chapter is that I'm, let's see, 15 here, and I've already had about 35 surgeries. And the one that's about to happen is not like the others. So the title of each chapter is taken from either a horror novel or a horror movie. And this one is called Body Parts. Chapter 13. Y'all can hear me? Oh, whoops, wrong chapter. This one is called Face Off. Sorry. Too many bookmarks. Chapter 24, Face Off. The great milestone of Jewish womanhood was the nose job. All around me were girls under the exact same spell of body dysmorphia. What a nice change it made, not to be alone in colossal self-loathing. Every one of us was convinced that rhinoplasty was the route to beauty. For me, my nose had become my body in miniature. Too sizable, too wide, too lumpen, too visible by far. I was certain that if my nose was corrected, the rest of me would magically follow. In the 1970s, ethnic diversity had yet to arrive in Cincinnati. Our ambition was to be as undiverse as possible. My friend Nancy had been asking her parents for a nose job since she was 11, until in desperation, she made herself swim directly into the concrete wall of the JCC bowl. She was sure that they had to come through now, since she could hardly go through life with the schnoz of a Ukrainian prize fighter. Nancy was but the most intrepid of the rhinoplasty devotees of Roselawn, my neighborhood. Walk down the sidewalk, and a Dr. Peerless nose came at you from one direction, while another, identical, Dr. Peerless nose passed you going south. Sidney Peerless was the plastic surgeon who remodeled all the Shayna Mabelas of middle-class Cincinnati. Like Nathan Hale, he had but one nose to give to his country. The doctor was famous for whittling cartilage into teensy little shicks of buttons. This was the first time I'd ever asked for a surgery, a very perverse act of adulthood. But my parents said no. Too expensive. I looked fine. I whined and wheedled until they relented. Peerless peered inside my nostrils and discovered his 10,000th deviated septum, yet one more of the epidemic of deviant septa sweeping the Jewish community. This was a kindness to my father. Peerless's diagnosis meant that Blue Cross Blue Shield would cover my nose, as it were. I lay on Peerless's exam table and explained that I did not want him to tilt my nose upward. I only wanted it narrowed, and please preserve that hook. The doctor's jaw dropped. This was a new one of him. But you'd be such a pretty girl. Here, let me show you. He picked up a mirror. Gloved fingers pushed my nostrils skyward. Right. See? What I saw was a man with serious fetish. I balked. But if you tilt my nose, I won't look like Cher anymore. It was embarrassing to admit, but I loved it when people said, "You're just like a miniature Cher." This was largely down to my hair, which hung past my waist in a thick red-black flag. Middle-aged moms and skeezy older guys alike asked if they could touch it. I couldn't do anything about my height, but Cher's profile was within my grasp. I liked looking Jewish. I just wanted to look elegantly Jewish, like Cher. He sighed and acquiesced. I woke up in the recovery room and touched my face. His betrayal was obvious, even under the swaddle of bandages. When the packing and gauze came out, my new nose indeed pointed to the sky like every other Peerless nose. Worse, the damn thing was asymmetrical. Not only did the tip have a rubbery bump the size of a lentil, the whole thing careened to the right. Accident? Intention? Or perhaps my body just refused to be normal, to blend in, to be anything other than its own peculiar self. My life would have been different had I listened to that lesson. After all, it was plain as the nose on my face. Thank you. And back to Riva.
That was great. That was great. You guys both went really quickly. Do you have anything else you want to add before we move on to Nessa about the book, about your art?
Well, I have pretty much no background in writing. This took me a long time. Started as a document for my family so that after I was gone, they'd know what my work was about because they were going to be my artistic executors. And then that led me to, so the way my portrait work goes is that I interview people at length about their lives, and particularly about the way that their experience of embodiment influences the work that they do. So I work with writers, performers, academics, visual artists. And what I'm interested in is how does your body, your sexuality, how you're seen in public affect the production of your life. So after doing quite a long series of interviews, usually, then we sit down and do portraits together that are collaborative and based on ethical structures. So because of this, I had a lot of stories about a lot of people, and I've always tried to get those stories out as much as the images. So the way my book really works is that it's an entanglement of stories, because the Golem, I assume most people out there know the story of the Golem, or the Golem in Yiddish. So because of my medical background, my history in surgery, I see myself as constructed, as having been built by dozens of doctors, many of whom left literal signatures in my body. I think of the scars as places they signed their name. There's a train coming. Anyway, But also in a different sense, I was very much built by the people I've known. I was in at the sort of beginning of disability culture, and I'll just say that I grew up absolutely hated myself, which you can kind of get from the that chapter. Disabled people were my generation was largely institutionalized, so we did not have role models or any idea of a future that we were supposed to have. So it was really these years and years of meeting people who had a different idea about embodiment, shared their stories with me, and then sat for me, that formed me into a different person than the one I was on my way to being. So that's primarily how the image of the golem works through the book.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll save questions for Riva for at the end. Now I want to move to our third author, Nessa Rapoport. Nessa was born in Toronto, Canada. She is the author of the novel Preparing for Sabbath, a collection of prose poems, a woman's book of grieving, and a memoir, House on the River, and her newest book, Evening. I'm sorry, it's hard to see my virtual background, but came out last month. Her essays and reviews have appeared in the New York Times and the Los Angeles Times, among other publications, and she lives in New York with her husband, artist Toby Kahn. That's us. Go away.
Thank you so much, Julie and Aaron and Riva. Thank you for giving us all a taste of your really compelling work. And thank you, everybody who came, for the gift of your time. There's been a lot of Zoom, and all three of us, I'm sure, are very happy that you lent us some time to talk to us and listen to us as writers. My novel, Evening, was supposed to be my easy book. The first chapter came to me in an instant, which had not happened to me and certainly hasn't happened to me since. And I believe that this one would pour out of me. The book I'd written previously, I'd spent 10 wonderful years writing, because it was an allegorical novel whose text alluded in English to Jewish texts that were never directly alluded to in the book. And this one, this chapter just came to me as a present. Two sisters, one grieving for the other, sitting in the living room of their childhood home, both in their 30s. Eve, the narrator, is funny, sardonic, and very indeterminate in her life. And Tam, her sister, who has died very prematurely, was Canada's foremost TV journalist, and had a wonderful husband and two delicious children and a big old house in Toronto, and had always been zooming into the future, whereas Eve was writing endlessly a dissertation about British women writers between the wars. So they're very, very different sisters. I regret to say that this book took me 30 years to write from start until September, when it was published. I can't explain exactly why that happened. I did publish 2 books in between, but I never lost interest in these 2 sisters. I think I can say that right from the beginning, in that first chapter, I knew 2 things. I knew they'd had a stupendous fight and did not make up in the last 2 weeks before Tam died. So Eve was carrying the burden not only of surviving her sister, but of never having reconciled at the end. And I knew that there was a very big secret that was going to be surfaced during the Shiva. To use Aaron's term, the frame of the book is the 6.5 days of Shiva. And I knew that Eve was going to find out something she didn't know about her sister that would upend not only her view of her sister, but her idea of her own future in many ways. And my challenge was to figure out what the sisters were fighting about and make it a strong enough reason for 2 sisters to stop talking in such dire circumstances, and also to propel my story forward once I knew what the secret was, and to disclose it to myself and to everybody else in a way that kept everybody moving. I was not used to writing a story with that kind of plot intensity, and it had its own responsibilities that I had to live up to. So for me, I began as a poet, and my work, all my work, whatever it is both about language and about the story. The language became my compulsion Some of you who may have heard me say this before, I was born a complete obsessive perfectionist and learned over time that it is a really hard way to live and an especially terrible way to raise children or afflict upon others. But in my own work, in my writing, it hurt nobody but me. So in addition to trying to figure out this story in a way that drew you in, I have in this exhibit a document that is 32 single-spaced, double-column pages of every word in this book that I checked to make sure it wasn't too close in proximity to any other word or repeated too often. I say that this took up the last year of my writing this book, but in truth, it took the last 3 years of my writing this book, but I found it completely satisfying. I was doing it only for myself. It was like embroidery where you wouldn't see the underside if I worked really hard. And it reads, abandoned, abash, abbreviated, abject, abound, above, abrades. You get the point. I like that Aaron used the word cerulean because my beloved writer friend Daphne Merkin has a wonderful aphorism. You can use only one cerulean in a book. And although this book doesn't have the word cerulean, one previous book of mine does. We then moved on, she and I, to the word gloaming and agreed that you could use only one gloaming in a book. And as I like to say, maybe not even one. So the language of this book was very, very important to me. It's a short book and has a lot of dialogue, and it really mattered to me, not only not to repeat words, but not to have characters sound the same, which is easy to do because I'm not a mimic. I had to really inhabit these people. And fortunately, I lived with them for such a long time that I was able to do that. I'm the eldest of 4 sisters, luckily all alive, but I have spent my life at kitchen tables riveted by the talk of women. So a lot of the book is about the unique relationship of sisters and the complexity of love, not only between sisters, but often between sisters, where you truly have a bond and a vocabulary that nobody else can share because no one knows us as long as our siblings do from the beginning to the end of life, ideally, if they survive and if you're both blessed, but also that love can be full of other emotions that are difficult, even at the same time as love prevails. So that was one theme. The other theme that really engaged me is the ways in which you can continue to work out relationships with people who have died, even though they're not present anymore. I feel this so strongly as I get older and try to renegotiate complicated relationships, even after the person's died. And I have come to see that it's possible. The person doesn't need to be there to gain compassion for a person who, let's say, was difficult, and also draw boundaries in ways that perhaps one couldn't do during life. And the last theme that turned out to interest me was, I'll summarize it from an expression I learned from AA, although I've not been in AA, which is never compare your insides to somebody else's outsides. These 2 sisters, one is the shiny sister with the glamorous life and all that one could wish for. And Eve is the indeterminate sister, as I said, fuzzy around the edges, unable to galvanize, which drives Tam crazy. But Eve actually isn't envious of her sister. The outside world assumes that she is, but she's really not. And in the many upheavals of this short novel, it turns out that Tam has reasons to be jealous of her sister, not the other way around. And I found that really, really intriguing. So I finally figured it out. And I wrote and rewrote and wrote and rewrote. I also have to say I avoided writing. It's one of my greatest talents. I worked as an editor in a publishing company, Bantam Books, as a senior editor for 10 years. I helped many people write their books. I did not follow my advice on how to write a book. So that's another reason for the 30 years. But I did feel when I finally was finished and finally had checked all my words for the final time, I had and I have a sense of serenity that I'd done what I set out to do that really did make the whole journey for me worthwhile. So I'm going to read to you from the very opening. There are a lot of spoilers that I can't read or share. In my family of origin, our idea of social exchange was that we all sat around the living room reading books and lifting up our heads and quoting things to the annoyance of the other people who just wanted to read. And I stayed up to finish it. It was the highest praise for a book. I cried for me was an even higher praise, because in high school, my mother cried when I read her something I'd written, and that was it. That determined my vocation forever, even though much, much later she said and reminded me that she was an easy cry, but by then it was too late. It had already happened. So I have had the experience since the book came out in September of having people say to me, I couldn't put it down. And that is worth a lot to me. It means that at least in one really crucial element of the narrative part of the book, I did what I set out to do. So this is the very opening of the book. One loves, the other is loved. So Nana taught us. I look at the beautiful bones of her face and speculate about this pronouncement. My grandmother has always been beloved, and so my grandfather, long dead, assumes a peculiar poignancy. Once, in some rapturous, unimaginable youth before she married, Nana was the ardent lover. But no one is alive to tell us about the object of her affection, and she will not disclose his name. We are sitting in the living room of my mother's house, waiting for the funeral to begin. Outside, the sky is the eerie pewter I remember from my childhood, lightless even at midday. In this room 6 years ago, before our mother recovered the furniture yet again, Tam and I were laughing at the weather. Then too, it was noon before I realized, after her baby's naming ceremony was over and the last guests had straggled out, that the day would not improve, that to quote Tam, this is it. I had fled to New York, whose winters are tamed by the city's determination to outwit the season. Tam not only stayed in Toronto, betraying our pact to leave the minute we could, but chose a profession that forced her to rise most mornings at 4 in order to be on the air. For her, the half year of darkness is permanent, I think to myself, and then think, permanent darkness. Paralyzed, I stare at Nana, imploring her to rescue me, but she is stoic, not emitting whatever feelings she no doubt has. The fact is, my sister, her eldest grandchild, is dead. The silence in this room is not the anticipatory hush preceding a family celebration, but the void of what cannot be accommodated. Tam, in speaking my sister's name, I have invaded Nana's solitude. I look at her carefully and observe, even in the somber room, that the skin beneath her eyes is gleaming. No one has seen my grandmother cry. Thank you so much.
That was great. That was great. I love your 32-page list of words. I got to do that for my next book. Oh my God.
I know, I want to do it too. I want to find out how you did that.
It's all the computer. You just press Control F and there's every one of those instances right before your eyes.
Yeah. Cool. I also really liked what you had to say about that even once a person has passed away, you can still learn new things or change your relationship with that person. I kind of feel the same way about writing. And when my book came out last year, and it took me 5 years to write, another 3 years to find a publisher, another year for it to come out. So it's like a 9-year process. And then in the launch process, I had to do a lot of interviews and people were asking me questions and I was having to think like, why did I choose this or that? And it was kind of revelatory. It continued to be revelatory even to this day, the whole writing process. So I never thought about it in terms of a person, that or your relationship with a person who's passed away. So, okay. So let's open it up for questions. I see there's already a question from Gula Gertz to Riva. You use the words entangled regarding the structure of your book and your own sense of being made up of pieces or structured by doctors. In writing your memoir, did you reach a sense of untanglement? What did the structure of the book, with its many excerpts often reminiscent of a lyric essay, inform you, teach you about monstrous fragmentation?
Uh, okay, I'm trying to understand the question. It sounds like there are three questions in there. So, if anything, writing the book made me feel more like a construction because I had to follow all the threads and when they came in and what they did when I met a certain person or when I went to an event that was transformative. So if anything, I feel even more like a compound creature. What was the last part of it? It was about monsters. Forgive me.
What did the structure of the book, with its many excerpts, often reminiscent of a lyric essay, inform you or teach you about monstrous fragmentation?
Well, I don't think of monsters in terms of fragmentation. One of the things about monsters, monster theory, I mean, every culture has monsters. They show up in a million different ways. There certainly are fragmented monsters I can think of from, oh my God, what was it that I used to watch where the monster would fall into sort of a swarm of roaches and scurry in different directions and then reform into a being. You know, there are versions, certainly. But the thing I really think about monsters is boundary violation, that you have this entity that violates boundaries in multiple ways, but two of the major are that monsters are usually a compound of, or a slamming together of two states. So human, animal, human, robot, live, alive and dead, male, female, all these different states. You can take almost any monster and pull it apart into what two things are colliding that are not supposed to. So you start with a creature that's a violation. And then from there, the monster itself violates boundaries by biting and sliming and having a miasma or infecting or taking over your mind with its evil rays. And so the fear we have of monsters is of being violated, is of being penetrated or invaded. So I love that. I love all of that because it makes us see where our boundaries are, what we think the boundaries are supposed to be, and what is a creature supposed to be. So as soon as you have a monster, it just throws everything up into like, oh, this is our assumption. And now the monster is going to try and knock that down. So I know it's not quite what you're asking, but that's, there's a lot to say about the structure of the book, but I'm going to stop.
Thank you. Nessa, there's a question for you from Janice Weitzman. Can you talk a little bit about the move from poetry to fiction?
Sure. Well, the large category is what I call the further humbling of Nessa Rapoport, which happens daily now, the older I get. I began as a poet because I have a very compressed, distilled way of thinking and writing, and I was impatient even with the thes and the ands. I just was very pure and ardent and wanted to get to the real thing. And I came to feel that poetry was marginal to the mainstream of the culture. And I'm a baby boomer, and everybody was reading novels. In those years, I used to joke, in the years that I went to college, if you hadn't read 100 Years of Solitude, don't show up. I mean, it was all anybody was talking about. The irony of all of this is, I think that fiction has become to our culture now what poetry was in my mind then. I don't feel, for me, I can't live without reading in books. I have been known to neglect when they were younger, my importuning children just to finish a book. I was that kid that read when I walked down the stairs. I must read, but I don't feel that a conversation about books is at the heart of our cultural conversation now for so many reasons that I don't need to get into. So in some ways, the move from poetry to fiction, which seemed a little instrumental, didn't turn out to mean what I thought it would mean. And meanwhile, of course, I have continued to write poetry. My husband is a visual artist, and he's had invited me to write meditations, I call them, or poems to accompany several of his exhibits. So it hasn't been lost, but I think the lyricism of this book is probably where that poetic impulse went. And I don't really have much more to say, except that my passion for language is exactly what it was from the minute I learned to read.
Well, having read your book last week, I can I love the language, so kol hakavod. Please say over
Thank
here.
you, Julie. If you see any repetitions, please don't tell me.
Okay, I will. Okay, I think anybody who'd like to ask a question can now unmute themselves. But while you're doing that, I'll ask, Jan, okay. Are these socially distanced times bringing back the novel reading? You know, I'm certainly reading way more than I thought. You know, I do that Goodreads challenge just to say, okay, I'm gonna read X number of books this year. And I think last year I read 58. So this year I'm like, oh, I'll get 60. I'm already way past 60, and we still have 2.5 months of the year left. But I'll let you guys, Aaron, Riva, Nessa, answer how you'd like.
Yeah, I can't say that I've been reading more this year, but I don't know if it's social distance or if it's just the general anxiety that if we don't get a good result in the American elections this November, that the world will go to hell. And my determination to do every single thing in my power to prevent that outcome. But I definitely think, it's interesting. In the past month, I have both cut my finger and also like twisted my ankle. And I just feel like we're constantly distracted right now. And maybe the phenomenon of being socially distant means that like more of our life is dependent on these online interactions. And so we're half in real life and half in our minds and half distracted. So maybe there's sort of a lack of focus there, and that doesn't really lend itself to reading. But that said, I just recently reread The Assistant by Bernard Malamud because I lead a book group and we're doing that next. And it was just such a pleasure to, even though it's such a depressing book, to escape into the beautiful world of language that Bernard Malamud conjures in The Assistant. So anyway, just want to give a shout out. I see my brother is waving on the chat like he wants to ask a question. So.
Let me see if I can unmute him.
Got it. You did it. You did it. Thank you, Julie. All right. And then I accidentally muted myself again. And then if I can do it again. Aaron, I love that description of the Nirvana concert. And you kind of teased this question, which is, how did you do that if you've never been to a Nirvana concert?
Thanks. Yeah, so I actually spent a long time while I was writing the book also watching documentaries, reading books about Nirvana, and then as it happens, there's a recording of that concert. So there's no video of that concert, but there's an actual recording of it, of the whole thing from start to finish. So I got to listen to it, and luckily for my purposes as a writer, something interesting happened, which was somebody threw a shoe at the stage, and Kurt Cobain threw it back and then walked off in a huff. So I was like, oh, good. And then the other thing was that I found like a blog post, somebody who had been to that very concert, writing about it and his experience and his excitement of it. So just a lot of reading and research and thinking about, trying to remember like what was on people's minds in the early 90s, vis-a-vis like the alternative music scene, and how it felt, I forget who was talking about self-reinvention, I think Riva with your piece, but it felt very much like Nirvana, like if you listen to Nirvana, somehow that gave you license to reinvent yourself. Personally, there was sort of that promise that we were going to be different because we're listening to Nirvana and not Michael Jackson. So I think that theme went very well with the progress of my main character, who's trying to also reinvent himself. So that's what I did to capture that experience. I wish I could have seen Nirvana, but I missed it.
I feel like I did. That was great.
Thank you.
Julie, it occurs to me we might want to talk before we close about the Jewishness of our work, especially since we have you and Modiin and a large audience, I presume, from Israel, I've always felt myself a supremely Jewish writer. And to the question about the poetry, I wasn't able to write long until I understood that Jewishness was going to be my subject. I used to joke in my early 20s that I was writing the Great American Sentence as I eked out words in a story that just wasn't that important to me, as it turns out. So what I'd like to say is, on my father's side, I come from a family of major rabbinic scholars, and I feel my obsession with the precision of language and my intoxication with words is very much in continuity with this lustrous, lost luster, I call it, of a rabbinic family next to whom I would always have an anomalous status as a woman, as the eldest of 4 sisters and no brothers in the 50s. Believe me, I heard about it all the time. I wasn't brought up to even aspire to be a rabbi at all, but I always knew that I had this background, and I say they may not have claimed me, but I do claim them in this regard of taking imagination and being very, very fastidious about how we say what we say. The characters in this book are Jewish. They're not as Jewy as some of my other books, but it is at the heart of the book. And the Shoah turns out to play a huge role in the book. Again, not under my control. I didn't expect it, but it did. So I'd be curious to hear from Aaron and Riva how you look at that question in your writing.
You know, it's really funny that you say that, because there's a scene in my book where the character who's not Jewish asks, you know, Ari, what is Jewish exactly? Is it a religion? Is it a, you know, is it a race? I keep hearing these different things about Jews. And I actually had that experience when I was in high school, because when I went to high school I went to a Jewish school until high school, and then I went to a non-Jewish school. And it was a private school that attracted students from all over the Detroit area, many of whom had never met Jews before, but had heard a lot about them. So I got to play ambassador, and you know, it's something that I thought a lot about, not just in terms of like how do I answer that question, but also it's interesting to me how a lot of the models of Jewish identity are very similar to the models of gay identity. There's a lot about like Jews and gays are sort of both accused of kind of being like snakes in the grass, fifth columns, as it were, like in the pernicious sort of, you know, anti-Semitic stereotypes and homophobic stereotypes. And there's also this sense of like a passing, you know, as a Jewish person, do you read Jewish to the like world at large, or do you blend in? And for gays, it's also that. And if you do blend in, are you somehow tricking people? You know, I think there's a lot to that question. I think it's a really complicated question, but I like what you say. I claim it, whether it claims me. I think it's a very important part of my identity as a writer. And certainly my book before this one, Faith for Beginners, is set in Israel. It's about an American Jewish family who travels to Israel. So there's plenty there to deal with that theme. Riva, what do you think?
Well, my relationship to Judaism is complicated. As everybody out there, okay, raise your hand if it's not complicated. So grew up in a very Jewish family. Lived with my grandparents part of the time when they were kind of modern Orthodox. I have family in Israel that is ultra Orthodox, and but here's the thing. I was the only disabled person in my family, and the idea was that my brothers and my cousins and everybody went to cheder, and I did not, because the idea was that I wasn't going to ever have a family, and the only reason to have a Jewish education was if you were going to reproduce. And so I wanted to go to cheder because there's nothing worse than having all your friends telling like inside jokes about going to Hebrew school, and you're like, besides which I loved the sound of Hebrew, and no education whatsoever. So I started off knowing that I was a reject from my own religion and from society, and then it just kind of snowballed into all kinds of being a reject. At the same time, my sense of self, my cultural references, my love of Yiddish. I chose the Golem as the guiding metaphor for the book because it's really deep in me. And I've done some study since then. But I think that it's a really strange time to be a Jewish writer. As we know, it's the rise of anti-Semitism. At times I find myself more shy about talking about being a Jew than I am about being a queer or a cripple. And which 10 years ago, I would not have expected that. But I feel like for various reasons, we have lost the cultural position of being able to speak from strength. And that it still exists if you're queer to some extent. It's becoming more possible to speak from that as a crip because we can speak from a position of understanding suffering and otherness and difference and compassion and political progressiveness and all the things I believe in. And for Judaism, it's gotten a little shaky because of the complexity of how people feel about Zionism. And so when you open your mouth and you start talking about being a Jew and being, deeply allied with it, whatever my background is, I'm completely 100%, theoretically kosher. I don't know what to do with my position as a Jew in the culture. I feel like we still have. When I grew up, I believed really strongly in the position of being a Jew in terms of being charitable, being progressive, being aware of what was going on in your community, being there for people who were not doing so well. I saw that over and over again in my family, in my community. And I worry that we've lost that way of being in public that can be believed. Now, I don't know what you guys think, but that's where my confusion is these days.
Well, maybe, it's like, I remember, Riva, when you were talking, reminded me very much of growing up in sort of the suburbs, Jewish suburbs in the 1980s, and hearing that message that somehow reproduction and being Jewish were kind of linked. like the point of being Jewish was to have Jewish children, and like everything was, it was like a bit, repopulate the world after Hitler. That seemed like really like, sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit.
I'm older than
messaging. But, also I think there was, maybe we had more of a idea that Judaism was all one thing. Jews were all one way, particularly after World War II. And I think now what we're seeing is like in every community, there's different, we're a rainbow too. And, and that doesn't mean that we can all be united in a certain way, but that also we can be united and insist on our diversity of perspectives and our diversity of experiences and our diversity of definitions of what it means to be Jewish. This past high holidays, I wasn't able to attend synagogue. And so I actually attended services in the synagogue that I used to attend in New York called CBST, which was the gay synagogue. And I remember the first time I ever went to a gay synagogue, I cried because I just didn't think that the two things could be possible, that you could be both gay and be, worshiping together. And the rabbi there gave such, Sharon Kleinbaum, she gave such a rousing Kol Nidre sermon that just kind of reminded me, like, part of what you're saying, part of being Jewish is tikkun olam, is to repair the world, however you would define that. For some of us, it's like beating Trump in November. For some of us, that's not the thing. But I think coming back to this idea of literature, I feel like literature is a form of tikkun olam. It is an act of faith. And, whether people are reading or buying our work, I think there's this, I forget the exact proverb, but it's like, if you save one life, it is as if you have saved the whole world. Well, what if that life that you save is your own? But the fact, like by writing, by having a daily practice of writing, you're saving your own life because you're affirming that the written word is important, that language means something, and that you believe it's important when you use words that you mean what they say. And it's like, I think the scholar A.E. Housman said, something is good because it's true. So anyway, I feel like I'm going to keep plugging away at this writing stuff because it's my tikkun olam, because it's like keeping me sane, and it's my act of affirmation, my act of faith. And then every time that we hear from readers, that like Nessa was saying, like I couldn't put down your book, that's like frosting on the cake. So
Beautiful. I love that, writing as tikkun olam, both for yourself and I think for your readers also. I could not put down your book. Nessa, yours, and Riva, I'm still waiting for my copy of yours to arrive. When I get it, I will, sure it will be the same. But that actually brings up another question I wanted to ask, which is, how are you guys? How are you finding writing now? Are you able to write in the midst of pandemic and elections? And if you have any tips for people that may be struggling to write right now, what are they? All three of you.
Do as I say, not as I do. I can truly say, except for writing at the request of certain platforms, great privilege, about evening, I have written not a word, even though that's not the advice I would give anybody. The advice I would give anybody is start something new the minute you finish, not even the minute you publish. I'm here to testify that if I take as long to write the next one as I took to write this one, you will be seeing me in another world, if you know what I mean.
Am I there?
Yeah, go ahead.
So for me, I'm in a weird position because most of my career has been in the studio, which is right over there. And, for 30 years, I've had people coming and sitting for me and sitting on the couch that's here. You can see my couch, which has hosted so many people. And now I can't. I can't have anybody in here. It's not big enough. Even if it was, I can't really draw someone at the other end of a warehouse. So the first thing I'm doing is trying to figure out how to continue that practice. I thought when I finished Golem Girl that I was going to be out of anything to write about because it's a memoir and it goes up to like 3 years ago. And so, okay, I'm done. But I'm starting to think about trying to do something in fiction with the help of friends who might know something about fiction. Pray for me. But the main thing is, I think that the thing about being an artist, whatever kind of art you do, is that, well, right now it's an incredible blessing because all the people out there who have jobs that where they have to be directed to be doing something that, not exactly being told, but they're part of an external structure that has to be there in order for them to work. They're having a really hard time. They're watching, a lot of Netflix on the couch and not drawing anybody while they're doing it. We're people who, no one asks us to do what we do. We just kind of are stubborn and insistent, and we go off and do it, not even knowing if anyone will ever publish it or show it or whatever. We just have that thing inside us. And so for anybody that has that, cup it like a flame, and also, like, I think that's all I'm gonna say.
Okay.
Well, I agree, Riva. It's interesting because my life in some ways is not that different from how it was in the pandemic in terms of my working life, because I was working from home, and like you say, I have to be self-motivated, because nobody is forcing me to write these things. And I have to say, I've been a much more productive writer than I've been a reader in the past few months, because I'm so used to having that schedule kind of built into my life. And I would say, a couple tips that I have, like when I'm blocked, is first of all, I'll quote from Anne Lamott, Bird by Bird. She has that wonderful chapter in her book called Shitty First Drafts. And like, it is so scary to write badly, but it is so necessary. And it gets actually scarier, I think, as I get older and more experienced at writing, because I just realize how bad my first drafts can possibly be. So I think I just have to like really let go of my ego and like make a big, big mess on the page and like not worry. And sometimes I even write on the page, scene to come here where this and this is going to happen. Like I don't even have the courage to write it, but I can think, well, if I did write this scene, this is what it would look like. And sometimes I even do those passages in like single space or in bold. And then I come and find them later and I say, okay, that part that was in bold, I'll like take off the bold and just make like a little mini scene there. And then I'll take off, and like my writing project is then to eliminate the bold. And so that kind of gives me permission. It's like, oh, well, that didn't count, and so it allows me to kind of write those shitty drafts. And then this is a great creative writing prompt that like I will just share with everybody. I think it's really, really helpful. It's called 40 things that happened to me and you can say last month, last week, yesterday, whatever. 40 things that happened to me, and just start listing them. 40 things, and just go and just list like the things that happened to you in your life. And then sometimes that just like it's easy to list, it's hard to write, but sometimes it's just easy just to list things that have happened to you. And then that kind of gets your brain going. And oh, that was kind of interesting. I'd like to write a little bit more about that. So that's one sort of little trick that I've used when I'm like really, really blocked and I can't think of anything else to do. I'll just list 40 things that happened to me.
Great. I'm a big believer in writing prompts. I like most of my stories and my book started from writing prompts. One little tip that I heard, I guess towards the beginning of the pandemic, I don't know if some of you may be aware of Grub Street. They're like a writing center based in Boston, and they were putting out these little short videos with their instructors, giving people tips on how to get unstuck. So I'll just share a couple that I liked. One was to write by longhand, which is actually how I wrote an entire draft of my novel that I'm working on right now. I wrote the whole thing in longhand because I figured if I did it on the laptop, I would just be revising the first paragraph 1,000 times. But something about writing by longhand kind of just gives you permission to write a shitty first draft. And another tip that they said was to read a couple chapters of a classic, like in the morning before you're starting to write. So I actually read Moby Dick during the pandemic, which I had never read before. And then when I finished that, I decided to read something more inspirational, a couple chapters or a couple pages of something before I start to write, and that also helps get the juices flowing. But I always need prompts, so I'm going to use that 40 things I did last week.
Could I throw a question out to everybody out there, whoever's a writer? The biggest problem I'm having right now with getting started with my next book is that it's very dependent on research. And it's research that I could do a little bit online, but would be much, much more effective were I able to go to the places that I want to write about. So I'm wondering if other people out there in this position and how they're handling it. Crickets.
Anyone feel free. I did a lot of research for my book, but it was all stuff I found online. I didn't feel like I had to go to the places, but I was able to find tons of sources and everything. I mean, I have one story. My book is, I didn't say at the beginning, but can't see, the Book of Jeremiah. It's a novel and stories. And the first story, chronologically speaking, takes place during the Depression. And I even, and it's about baseball. I even found like the box scores of the baseball game that I wanted to write about. So there's a lot that you can do online. Obviously, to get the sensory details of a place, it might be hard, but I wrote a story once about it takes place in New Mexico, and people were like, "Wow, how did you know that?" I'm like, and that even that I researched online because I've only been to New Mexico once. It was like 30 years ago. But I don't know. Other people have other suggestions.
I see Michelle Topaz is raising her hand.
Yeah, hi, Riva. That's such an amazing question because it's so interesting because a pandemic gives you like time to write. But I was on the verge of starting to write something. I had even, mapped it out kind of the way Aaron is saying. I want to write about my grandparents' experience in surviving the Holocaust in Salonika. So I had a whole trip planned, and then, excuse my French, bullshit hit. So that ain't gonna happen anytime soon, and it pisses me off to no end. It really annoys me, and it's so close, right? So I find myself vacillating between, you know what? Write it, because it doesn't exist there anymore anyway. It doesn't exist there. The place that I want to go doesn't really exist. It's been ruined. It's too many years have passed, and being annoyed. I find myself vacillating between those two. And I don't know, maybe that gives me a push to a certain extent, but it also stops me at the same time.
Well, I actually heard a piece of advice that might be helpful for you from the writer Dolan Perkins Valdez, who's a historical novelist. And I asked her, she writes these books that are set around the time of the Civil War in America. And I said, I can't even imagine like how you would go about doing that. And she's, do you research first? Do you write? She said, I write a draft to figure out what I need to research.
Wow.
Yeah, that is.
And that's really helpful because like if you're trying to capture like 1865 America, like you could just go forever with research. Like you could research tons and tons, and you wouldn't, whereas like if you write the draft, it's like, oh, I need to find out like what people ate for dessert in Savannah, Georgia. Like that I could find, and I do agree. I think it was Julie. It was like, you can find the people have the weirdest websites online, like, a history of popular telephones from 1930 to 1940. I mean, it's kind of amazing.
Yeah, so it's funny because of the fact that I feel like I'm being directed melamala from above by these grandparents who have since passed away, of course. They keep throwing things at me, and I'm going to start learning Ladino tomorrow, as a matter of fact, online, which never would have happened otherwise. So, kismet,
Cool.
whatever you want to call it.
That's cool. I just had another idea for Riva, that when I wanted to get a sense of what something looked like, I would just put it into Google, like 1930s Depression era Bridgeport, right? And I would look at the images that would come up, and it gave me ideas for little details to add into my story. Or you could do that with anything. I mean, you can't get the sense of, smell and sound from those pictures, but at least you can get a little bit of sense of what things look like. It's just an idea. Anybody else? Oh, Nessa, go ahead.
I just want to say something that struck me in listening to both Aaron and Riva talking about Jewishness and marginality. I feel so strongly, I would say fiercely, that this inheritance belongs to all of us, and that each of you in the work you've just finished releasing into the world is claiming a kind of citizenship in the Jewish polity by expanding the imagination of what Jewishness looks like. And I just want to encourage all of us, including me, born in the 50s and claiming my inheritance as a feminist, which I think Jewish feminism saved my life. It belongs to all of us, and no one can take it from us. And it's up to us not only to interpret what we inherited, but to recognize the vast richness of what you can do when you decide to play with it. It's in a way an advantage to be a little bit marginal, because you don't have the weight of centuries of prohibitions about imagination. I don't mean things as literal as the images commandment, which I don't believe in at all, being married to a visual artist. I mean, we're free by being outsider insiders. And I just want to encourage everybody on the call, recognize that it's ours.
I love that. That is beautiful. I don't see any other questions. Does anybody, I'll give it another minute before I end the meeting. If anyone wants to say anything else, unmute yourselves or put it in the chat. But I really enjoyed listening to all three of you and seeing the comments from people in the crowd. So thank you all for joining us. This was another wonderful evening, and it's part of my Tikkun Olam. Let's put it that way. That I love having these evenings.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. Thanks for reading. Thanks for having us.
Thank you all. Have a good week. Vote if you are in the United States, if you haven't already. All right. Bye all. See you next time.